This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
The virus, the fungus, and the toolkit. These three things have dominated the discourse in the country for some days now. What is this social media toolkit that politicians across party lines are worried about? The government and the opposition are relentlessly attacking each other, both claiming it's a conspiracy against them. Caught in the crossfire is the microblogging site Twitter, which labeled tweets of certain politicians over the toolkit as manipulated media. What happened next is a visit by the Delhi police at the Twitter office demanding an explanation. This is not the first time that a toolkit has grabbed the attention of the nation. A toolkit leak during the farmers' protest earlier triggered much outrage and led to arrest of some activists on allegations as serious as sedition. In this podcast, we will break down for you what these toolkits are, how seriously should these toolkits be taken, and why should we be concerned. From the Economic Times, I'm Rachita Prasad and you are listening to The Morning Brief. We have with us today three guests who have been looking at the toolkit issue very closely from three different angles. Our first guest is Prateek Sinha, co-founder of fact-checking outlet Alt News. He and his team have made debunking misinformation their mission in life. Our second guest is Ramanjeet Singh Cheema, Asia Policy Director and Senior International Counsel at Access Now, which is a non-profit dedicated to defending digital civil rights of people around the world. And finally, Vasudha Venugopal from the Economic Times, a senior political journalist with access to the power corridors. She's tracking the development around toolkits and the politics behind it closely. Welcome to the podcast, Prateek, Raman, and Vasudha. Let's get started with you, Prateek. You have been working on debunking misinformation and have closely tracked fake news, propaganda, misinformation on social media. Tell us, what is a toolkit and why should we be concerned?
A toolkit is what the English word sounds. I mean, there's nothing magical or nothing mystical about it. A toolkit is, in the social media terms or in a strategy terms, people put together a set of action items that they want to do around a campaign, around an issue. This is going to be a social media strategy. This is what we are going to do on X date. This is what we are going to do on Y date. That's pretty much what a toolkit is. But there's a rudimentary version of it, which a lot of political parties use, which is not a full-fledged toolkit. And most political parties use that. And that is basically a set of pre-recorded tweets, pre-recorded in the sense that the text is given, images are given, videos are given, a time is given, and a hashtag is given. And this happens every single day. Parties like BJP, Congress, they all do this. So there's nothing mysterious or mystical about toolkit.
Interesting, because what you're saying sounds like just a regular social media strategy plan and, kind of setting up templates for what is the message that they want to amplify. So what is the main concern here? Because, you look at propaganda and fake news as well. Are toolkits also being used to spread that kind of news?
See, a strategy can be around anything, right? Toolkit is just a document. Now, a document may contain anything. What is the allegation currently is that on May 18th morning, 8 screenshots were put out, 4 screenshots of 2 documents. So 4 screenshots each of 2 documents. One document was, let's call it the Vista document, which was a document around how Central Vista is being constructed during the pandemic and how that is an issue, how that has angered people, how it is a political issue. The second set of screenshots, let's call that the toolkit document, that had about 7 to 8 action items from, how Congress volunteers are supposed to act, how Kumbh Mela is supposed to be the center of political propaganda, how it should be called super spreader, etc. How the phrase India strain or Modi strain should be repeated on social media, these kind of action items. Now, some of the action items were quite devious. If this were authentic, we at this point in time don't know whether it is authentic or not, and it would seem that it is inauthentic. But if it were authentic, some of the action items were very devious. One of them, for example, in the section around volunteerism around pandemic, the claim was that keep certain beds occupied and beds in friendly hospitals and towns, keep them occupied and release it only on request. Now, during the time of a pandemic, an action like that, it comes across as very devious. So those are the kind of things which were there in the document, which became the center of much outrage. The toolkit itself, whatever the toolkit that is being referred to as toolkit inauthentic or authentic, has a few issues. Number one, the letterheads don't match. What we had done is we had asked Congress to send their research documents, and we compared the letterhead being used in the present toolkit to the original documents that Mr. Rajiv Gowda has sent to us, and they do not match. Of course, that is not enough reason to declare any document as fake. Secondly, a lot of action items that were discussed in this document, which is being alleged that Congress produced it, were action items in the past, things which have already happened in the month of April. Now, toolkit by the very definition is supposed to chart a future course of action and not really focus on what has happened in the past. And this toolkit in the heading is stamped as May 2021. Then the other thing that we found out was that there was another screenshot which was shared, which is called the file properties screenshot. And that is basically you right click on a file and you figure out what the file properties are. Now that shows that the document is called Central Vista something. Now those file properties matched one of the documents that we received from Congress and which has been termed as authentic by Congress. The second document, which is actually the document which is what is causing the outrage, nobody has released any evidence of that being authentic till now, not even a digital footprint, forget even an original document. The final thing that we found out was that the first account that has released the file properties screenshot was a account called Modi Bharosa, which 10 days before this, that is on May 8th, had put out a detailed thread claiming that there's a new toolkit in town, and the content of the thread was identical or nearly identical to what eventually came out in the toolkit. And this particular handle, Modi Bharosa, is known to have been handled by people who are now working with the Union Ministry. They have stated this officially on their Twitter profiles that they were heading this particular initiative, Modi Bharosa, which has been on since before 2014 elections, and which is, of course, sort of a BJP initiative. So these are the few things about the toolkit as to what raises much suspicion about the authenticity of the toolkit.
कांग्रेस पार्टी का एक टूल किट चल रहा है कि किस प्रकार से ये जो महामारी है, ये जो कोरोना का पेंडेमिक है, उस पेंडेमिक में भी, उस विपत्ति में भी किस प्रकार राजनीति करनी है और किस प्रकार से भ्रम की स्थिति को उत्पन्न करते हुए कांग्रेस पार्टी अपने राजनीतिक मंसूबे को मजबूत करना चाहती है। वह इस टूल किट से पूरा देश आज कांग्रेस के मंसूबों को, कांग्रेस के इंटेंशंस को, कांग्रेस के जो भ्रम फैलाने की नीति है उसे जान रही है।
ये बिल्कुल फर्जी बात है, क्योंकि ये तो सच है कि टूल किट तो ये भाजपा ने ही बनाई है। तो क्या हुआ, उन्होंने पीएम को निकम्मा और अमित शाह को गायब और राजनाथ सिंह को दरकिनार और निर्मला सीतारमण को असंवेदनशील कह डाला। इसका मतलब भाजपा के लोग, भाजपा की ट्रोल आर्मी अपने नेताओं के बारे में ये सोचते हैं। पहली बात तो ये है। दूसरी बात ये है, इन्होंने कहा कि ये टूल किट कांग्रेस ने बनाई है। जी नहीं, कांग्रेस ने पूरा एक दस्तावेज तैयार किया था सेंट्रल विस्ता पर।
Vasudha, you have been tracking this case very closely. Can you just get us up to speed on what really has happened so far with respect to this alleged toolkit?
Well, as far as we know, the raid that happened in the offices, it was not a raid. It was basically called a raid to start with. That's what the messages that we got said. But it was a very publicized, search operation.
And aren't they calling it a visit?
They're calling it a visit right now. But we were told by Delhi police sources, the messages that we got was it was a raid. And that is why a lot of us reported that it was a raid to start with on online media. But then it was a very publicized, serving of notice. And it's strange because the government and Twitter have been in talks with each other for a long time. And this happened immediately after Twitter flagged Sambit Patra's post as manipulated, and then Delhi police got into this. So it just looked like, the police and the government are trying to do something what the party wants. So this is something that's only for discussion, but this was what was felt widely. Now what has happened is Delhi police, of course, has served notices to two Congress leaders, Rajiv Gauda and Rohan Gupta, and Congress has decided to pursue the matter in Chhattisgarh. In Chhattisgarh, of course, the police has summoned Sambit Patra, who was among the first to post this document that's called a toolkit by the BJP leaders. So this is where the matter stands right now. I think the investigation is still on.
So right now, from what we understand, the police is looking into it, but we don't really have clarity on the authenticity of the document itself, is it?
Yeah, the government has not really done anything to look into the authenticity of the document. It was only after Alt News put out this detailed report looking at metadata that a lot of us actually realized that, there are some questions regarding the authenticity of it. And Congress also said that a part of it, which is the Central Vista material, which, it was part of their research thing, and it was all there in the public domain. It is something that the Congress has made very clear that they don't want this project. But other than that, the stuff regarding Kumbh Mela or Eid celebrations were were contested, and it also led to a lot of other things happening. For example, once this Kumbh Mela thing got out, once this alleged toolkit got out, you had this Mahamandleshwar of Juna Akhada sending out a video message saying that, what Congress is doing is demeaning Hindu rituals, and they should not be, insulting our religion, which is like the basis of our civilizational ethos. You had Swami Ramdev talking about it. I was counting, there are almost like 28 MPs who have put out different kinds of messages. So this just looked like, it was not just limited to the BJP leaders. It also trickled down to the larger Sangh Parivar members.
So that is the political part of it. But let's look at the legal aspect of it. Raman, if Twitter, Facebook, all these social media sites have of late become very, very careful about fake news. And, there's a lot of pressure on them to control misinformation. Twitter, in fact, went ahead and even banned the US President Donald Trump at one point of time. So what is the legal basis for the government to send a notice to Twitter asking them to take down the manipulated media label that they had put on tweets by politicians like Sambit Patra?
So the government doesn't have a very strong legal basis to force the taking down of a label, particularly any labeling of content relating to misinformation. What the governments, in fact, try to do here is, if you notice, is be very careful and try to say, we're giving you an advisory directive indicating that what you're doing is something that we find problematic. We believe an intermediary should only be letting users post content, namely, what third parties might be posting on their platform. You shouldn't be taking a role directly in deciding if that content should be labeled or not labeled. And unfortunately, that's also a little bit misleading when it comes to the government's own policy messaging and signaling in previous instances, because they've actually been quite active recently on talking about how platforms need to do more. And in the set of regulations they passed in February of this year, the intermediary liability due diligence rules issued under the Information Technology Act, and they've been criticized as being excessive and harming fundamental freedoms and human rights. They actually tried to say that platforms should be taking automated measures to monitor flag content. And in this case, where this is not even an automated measure, it's partly automated but more dependent on people flagging to Twitter that media posted by one of its users might be manipulated. The government's trying to say you can't do this. So it's a bit hypocritical of them. And legally speaking, they cannot direct an intermediary to not label content if it's following their policies. What they could have done was issue a web censorship order under Section 69A of the Information Technology Act, saying the label itself is something we want you to censor. But perhaps they know how badly that would have gone down, and it would have been legally suspect there as well, and they didn't do that. But that is the only route they could have gone down, and I think a lot of legal opinion on this is pretty consistent, that the government claiming legal basis to say that labeling of content should not be done if something is found to be misleading is not something that would easily fly. It's not something that most judges would be sympathetic towards.
But, this is not really the first time a toolkit has been in controversy. Prateek, you have looked at this very closely. For example, earlier the Greta Thunberg toolkit leak happened during the farmers' protest, and it had some very serious repercussions. People like Disha Ravi were arrested. Would you say both incidents were similar in the way that they were given an anti-national color? What has been your key finding in these two particular incidents?
The farmers' protest, that was a series of documents. That was not just one document. I had downloaded all the documents when they had first come out. And those were a series of documents of detailed planning over several days as to which influencers they will engage, what they will tweet out approximately, which day, what sort of propaganda will be done. And from a reading of what was put out in that protest, there was nothing devious in that. I mean, getting influencers to tweet, that happens every day. Political parties do that all the time. So as far as the farmers' protest toolkit is concerned, it was a genuine document. We found it actually on Instagram, where people associated with this one said organization, I forget the name of the organization, were actually circulating the toolkit. And eventually the claim was that this is an internal document that they were using to organize the protest.
Vasudha, you have been tracking the bickering between political parties for a long time, and traditionally politics has always been about political parties trying to make their opposition look bad. I mean, this is how it has been forever. What is it that is making the government react so strongly to this toolkit?
Well, I think, I understand this issue politically because in the last 7 years, there have been many protests of women, farmers, Dalit organizations. And every time, at least a section of the government or the section of the Sangh Parivar have addressed the protesters in the same way. You vilify them, you make them seem like they have been influenced by a foreign hand, and that, they probably don't value Indian ethos or Indian systems that much. So more than reacting strongly, I think the Sangh Parivar also likes to play up the toolkit issue because it really fits well with their narrative that, they're trying to tell you that the protesters are doing this because all of this is part of a script or a design, and it is probably, part of a very evil plan that is conceptualized by somebody sitting in Pakistan or abroad who wants India to suffer. So a toolkit also helps the BJP, this is as far as I understand, bring out its very assertive take on nationalism and the way it handles freedom of speech. This whole thing about main desh ko jhukne nahi dunga, come what may. So, we are the people who are always watching out for all these dangers, and we will protect you from all these hidden forces. When I look at the toolkit controversy, even during the Disha Ravi case, just like Prateek pointed out, I do think that it helped the people, the ruling party, to at least establish some sort of connect that Indian activists have with global far-left activists, and even some of those with militant ideologies. It could be false, but this is the narrative that they set in, and it helped them a little bit, or at least they think it did. It's the same way, I've covered Shaheen Bagh. It's the same way they would do with, say, talking about pro-Pakistan slogans in Shaheen Bagh, or pro-Khalistan flags in the Singhu protests. So I think it helps sometimes to tell people, their own voters, that, the government might fail in one or two policy matters, but when it comes to protecting the country, when it comes to nationalism, we are there for you, and, we will not let the country be taken over by these forces. And I do speak to a lot of BJP supporters, and a lot of them don't really understand what this toolkit is. They just think of it as this very dangerous script or a plan that, all of them have been asked to execute. And I think it's the new Tukre Tukre is what I believe. So I think it really helps the larger right-wing ecosystem, because I think they think it is their strength, to bring out their very assertive take on nationalism.
That's interesting because, what you said about tukre actually became a term which people didn't even bother looking deeper into, and just brand anybody as the tukre gang. And there's a certain connotation that came with it. And it seems that the same thing is happening with the toolkit. I have seen a lot of WhatsApp groups discussing it. People who are not even present on a lot of social media, they have caught onto this term and they just think it's like a devious tool that is there to destroy the image of the country. But we'll have to see how this goes on, because clearly nobody is abandoning the toolkit or the social media strategies. Raman, you have spoken about this particular case. This current toolkit episode and the previous one has raised some questions about dissent, open internet, and the rights of the users. There's been a lot of speculation about India actually banning Twitter, ironically, as it may be, on Twitter. What are the facts on this and how will it play out?
Sure. And I think it's important to, as you noted, go into the facts of what's happening here, because there's been a lot of public posturing and perception. And I would, in fact, unfortunately, have to say that it seems like some of that has been actually perpetrated by spokespeople or by people close to the ruling party, perhaps to be seen as, oh, look, we're taking strong action. Look, if any tech platform takes a position against us, they can suffer consequences. So a lot of this is sometimes political commentary or political signaling, and not necessarily something that's clearly legally linked. In terms of what the situation is, there are a couple of things. One is, of course, tech companies participating or cooperating with any investigation. Then there is the question about whether online intermediaries such as Twitter, Facebook, but also many other companies, significant social media intermediaries, whether they would begin to comply with the many different onerous provisions included by the government in its February 2021 intermediary due diligence code regulations, which, as you also know, applies to online digital news services as well as streaming video services. And the deadline for that essentially kicked in this week. And then, of course, the last one is, could the government generally block, a social media service like Twitter per se? Now, I think it's important to understand that, companies may be cooperating or not cooperating with elements of the investigations. We'll see more about that in the future. A lot of that's very at initial stages. When it comes to the intermediary liability due diligence rules, a lot of the companies have said that they will be implementing it, but they are not fully sure how it will fully apply. I think there's nearly if not uniform, but nearly consistent pressure or questions from most actors in the internet sector saying what you're trying to force us to do is not fully possible, is very, not just onerous, would have implications for cybersecurity as well as for people's protected fundamental rights. And what you've seen, therefore, is that people are now gone to court about it, with, as of May 26th, it becoming public that WhatsApp has filed a lawsuit in the Delhi High Court challenging the intermediaries' rules regards to how to reply to messaging social media services such as itself. And you've seen multiple challenges against these rules being filed by digital news publishers across different high courts in the country, and with, in fact, some interim orders already against the government. Now, can the government go ahead tomorrow and say, oh, we're going to block Twitter, Facebook, X company because it's not complying with the due diligence rules, or because we don't like it generally? Well, they have the legal power to issue web censorship orders. That power could be taken up to blocking entire domains. That means an entire service as a whole. The government has, as you know, in the past done that with services when it was having a showdown with China on the border in the context of several Chinese linked services. Would that be legal? And the last one is the tricky one, because in effect, I would say it wouldn't be. Blocking an entire service, an entire website, is something that is significant and by and large regarded as disproportionate by human rights lawyers and by judicial experts. So if you've seen other countries, perhaps countries that, who, the ruling party and coalition are modeling some of their behavior on. But if you look at, for example, Turkey, which has blocked entire social media sites or online sites from time to time in order to force compliance with what Erdogan and his AKP party have been seeking to achieve. You've seen those orders being challenged before the European Court of Human Rights, because Turkey is a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights has actually said blocking entire websites is generally disproportionate and would never be regarded as legal. And that's something that's also there in the UN human rights system, which India is a party to and active with. Of course, we must also remember that India has the ignominy of being the world's leader in internet shutdowns. So we've gone and shut down the internet, which is the most disproportionate step ever, many more times than any other country in the world at present.
India has blacked out the internet more than any other country since January 2016, updating colonial-era telegraph and criminal laws to apply to the internet. The most frequently targeted state is Jammu and Kashmir, with 37 blackouts this year and counting. Kashmir was also the site of India's first documented internet blackout in 2012 and has been shut down every Independence Day since. The government says the blocks help safeguard against the separatist insurgency.
Vasudha, wanted to get your view on this. You have been interacting with the government and other political parties. What do you gather about their stance on this? And also, we have to remember that the same platforms have been a big source of spreading messages and narratives by the ruling political party as well. So what is the stand here, and should we be prepared for the government reacting more strongly on such matters going ahead?
I think social media is very important to the ruling party. It is an extension of their campaign trail. They were the first to read the trends of reaching out to, particularly young voters. And, wherever I cover elections, I see that they take social media reports very seriously. So wherever they are fighting elections, they also crowdsource their manifesto. They get their details of booth workers, even that is through WhatsApp, their Facebook, all of these details. So it's very important. Social media is very important for the BJP, but they also understand that it's a tool that can be weaponized by, the opposition parties, especially when the narrative goes against them. So that is why I think, they brought in a lot of these regulations. Raman talked about these new IT rules which have come out on February 26th. The government calls it a light touch regulation, but believe me, I cover the OTTs, and there is so much ambiguity and lack of clarity about what is going to happen right now, and this is happening to creative filmmakers, and social media platforms are supposed to be platforms for citizen engagement, but there is a lot of lack of clarity on what is really going to happen, because my understanding is, even when it comes to content, the government kept telling us that we keep getting a lot of complaints about the content. But when I looked at all the complaints that had, all the FIRs that had been lodged against OTT content, most of them were by politically motivated workers, like, different parties. It was not like regular people are going out in the streets and protesting against some scene in Tandav or, some kiss in Suitable Boys. So the government is doing a lot of these things and calling it in the interest of public, which really is not the case. And, just 15 days ago, we also saw that, the government did order Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to take down dozens of social media posts which are critical of the pandemic. And, they said that it could be inciting, panic, and, they had pictures that could be taken out of context. So I think this is where the government needs to really focus if they're bringing in newer forms of censorship. And it's very evident that they probably are, or they are restricting citizens' engagement or creativity, just in the guise of, making these platforms accountable, which really doesn't seem to be the case to a lot of us.
Makes sense. Raman, you spoke a little bit about, the intermediary guidelines that came into action on May 26th. The deadline was on May 26th. And Vasudha pointed out about the censorship and how government is looking at it. Do you see room for guidelines that can make things more streamlined? What can the government do right now so that the social media platforms are more streamlined, but at the same time, the human rights and freedom of speech is not compromised?
So the first thing the government can do is very simple. It can simply just cancel and take back or recall the intermediate due diligence rules. There is nothing that I can say that, really can defend, justify, explain why they should exist, because the rules that the government's issued are incredibly Orwellian, overbroad, unclear, and meant to encourage censorship and encourage technology companies cooperating with government requests rather than safeguarding user interests. These guidelines have no legal basis or no legal authority to cover digital news services. The sole thing that Parliament allowed the government to do, Parliament said that we will give legal immunity, qualified legal immunity to internet intermediaries, whether they be telecom companies, tech platforms, and others, people who enable user communication, like for you and me. But what the government was supposed to do there was just define very basic due diligence. And what, for example, the rules instead do is they allow the government to specify the terms of service that every intermediary must put out, no matter what it might be, whether it's a comment site for online news portals or whether it's a university website. It says that you must take immediate action on complaints that are filed if you're a significant social media intermediary. And for example, it actually says that significant social media intermediaries need to retain the data of their users for well over 6 months, over half a year. And if the government requires them to trace the originator of a message on that platform, they need to enable that, even if that requires them to undermine end-to-end encryption, which is not something that's explicitly there in the rules, but talk to any engineer or product manager who works in the space and they'll say, yes, the implication of a traceability mandate based on what the government's put there is that your secure communications, your end-to-end encryption, whether it's on online platforms or whether it's on things such as WhatsApp or Signal or other services like that, would be undermined. And there are many other measures there, as I mentioned, like the fact they're extending the ambit of these rules to cover digital news services, to also cover streaming video. And that's what boggles my mind, is that they've created a set of Orwellian demands for internet intermediaries, but they've also in effect made a power grab, a regulatory grab for digital news services and for streaming video sites, which in fact Parliament never really allowed them to regulate right now in the first place. And it seemed in fact that the Ministry of Electronics and IT was keen to get as many powers as it could without going to Parliament. So what it actually needs to do today is recall these rules, hold an open, frank, clear public discussion. If it believes it needs new legal powers, which it needs to make the case for, it needs to put them out publicly, and it needs to go to Parliament and even get Parliament to enact it there, but enact it in a rights-protecting way.
That's very, very interesting because, you're clearly saying that on one hand, there is this guideline and regulatory framework, which is going to lead to a concentration of power with the government. Prateek, finally, I'll want you to come in here because there are a lot of things that we'll have to just wait and watch, and we'll have to see how the government actually handles it. But all said and done, there's not much influence people like you and me may have on the government. What we can do as common people is something that I want to understand from you. I mean, it has really become difficult for the common man to differentiate between news and views. With access to the internet rising and misinformation increasing, what are the key concerns? And what can a common man do to be sure that the information he or she is consuming is not meant to manipulate them?
Historically, let's say about 15 years ago, the media organization, the journalists were the gatekeeper of information. They were the ones who were trying to figure out whether information is authentic or inauthentic and relaying the information to people at large. I'm not saying that it was a perfect process or everything was authentic or not, but at least there was a gatekeeper of information. Now, what has happened today is that everybody is a recipient of information and anybody can put out information. So in a sense that people who are not trained to figure out whether something is authentic or not authentic, everyone has a right to put out information, and which is good in a way. It has brought a lot of benefits, but it has also created this huge issue of misinformation because people are not trained to figure out what they're putting out is authentic or not authentic. And of course, India is an increasingly polarized country with deepening biases, which add to the problem because the biases are so strong that we want to believe things that adhere to our belief system. So that is broadly the problem. Now, to expect people at large to be able to do something about it without training, imagine bringing somebody who's never been in a city and has never seen a traffic light, getting them and putting them on a traffic zone and asking them to figure out, how the traffic light works. It is like that. So expecting, if you use the broad term common people to start doing something about it, it's a difficult expectation. We first need to put the onus on the governments and the education system that they need to educate people so that they enable people to do something about it. Secondly, people who already have some amount of education around the issue, my standard advice is that all misinformation is, at least most misinformation, is designed to manipulate you at an emotional level. There is a specific emotional trigger that is designed as part of misinformation, where they're trying to emotionally trigger you. That emotional trigger numbs your rationality, and that is when you end up pushing the forward button. And that is what you need to be wary about. That is, when you have that emotional trigger. I know it's sort of a difficult thing to do, but we have seen that, by working on this issue again and again, that is something that becomes second nature. And again, that is what training does. So at the end of the day, what at least the people who have been involved in the fact-checking industry, they have been saying that what we really need is media literacy programs, information literacy programs. Fact-checking in a journalistic format is just not enough.
Thank you so much, Prateek. The example that you gave about the traffic signal, it just makes sense. I mean, that's how alien things may seem to people. First things first, a toolkit is nothing more than a social media plan. So there is nothing devious about it per se. I think we need to keep this in our mind. And as is clear from our discussion, while there are still concerns about the authenticity of this particular toolkit, it looks like there is not a very clear provision legally for the government to take action against it. The Indian government is giving mixed signals to social media companies, on one hand asking them to be cautious, and on the other, pulling them up when they do practice caution. Any strong measures by the government could be seen as a disproportionate reaction and in violation of human rights and freedom of speech. While the government needs to streamline its policy, there is a very strong case to increase media literacy and increase awareness among people about information and misinformation. While we will keep an eye on these developments and keep you informed, here's hoping that the awareness level towards misinformation increases going ahead. And I'm sure our three guests who are writing on these matters and making these matters more public will be able to contribute towards the cause. That's all from us for today. I'm Rachita Prasad and you've been listening to The Morning Brief. This episode was edited by Nehal Chaliawala. Bhavya Dilip Kumar coordinated it. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. We look forward to your feedback. Write to us at themorningbrief@timesgroup.com. And if you like this episode, please do share it on social media. The Morning Brief airs every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Thank you for listening and have a great day. All external sound clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credit mentioned in the description.